I was so dissociated from my body, and the reason why is just because of all of the, let's just say the volume of sensation had reached a threshold that it's just becomes like a maladaptive coping response
Right.
to just go into compulsive thinking, right? You're not deciding that, but it's just the way it goes, right? And as we kind of work with the body, whether it's TRE or some other modality that's kind of getting to this repressed emotion, and excess sensation, what happens is then it just becomes a natural thing to just kind of like rest in that body sense. It just becomes easy. It doesn't require effort or meditation. It's just we realize like that silence that we've been seeking through meditation is actually always already been here. It's just like we've
Right.
got like static noise that's covering it up, largely from unprocessed emotion.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Christina Guimond. Chris is an awakening and non-dual realization guide who works with the trauma release exercises that I've spoken about previously on the podcast. You can listen to my interview with the creator of the TRE approach, David Berceli, if you want more details on the practices themselves. Chris and I connected over the fact that we've both found this combination of TRE and non-dual integration to be incredibly powerful, yet no one else in this space seems to be talking about it. On her own journey, Chris worked with previous podcast guest Angelo Dillulo, and he's now started recommending these practices to his audience as well, thanks to Chris. I think we'll see this combination spread in years to come, and so I'm very grateful to Chris for her work in promoting TRE in the awakening and non-duality space. Hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, I think I put a comment on your channel a couple of years ago, in response to you. I think it was you did a video about a San Pedro, I believe, retreat that you did in
Right,
Portugal.
right. Yeah,
And
yeah.
then somewhere in the middle of it, you just maybe two or three sentences mentioned TRE. And
Okay.
I was very excited about that because I thought, wow, like I just felt like more people should know about that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I was really glad to hear from you because I think we both had a similar feeling of like, why isn't everyone talking about this? It kind of, my experience was, so I'd had a profound awakening as a teenager, and then um, as often happens with those kind of awakenings, there's like a sense of finality that is, you've seen the absolute perspective. No matter what happens, it's all part of what is. So it's like there's no point doing integration. There's no point doing anything. So I wasn't really interested in. I was coming out from this kind of bypassy place for a long time in my kind of early adulthood, uh, and then stumbled into through psychedelics the kind of the integration stuff, the body stuff, and then through that, I guess it's kind of like I'd always looking back, I'd always had really serious like bodily tension. And I didn't understand it that way at the time because, it's crazy to me now that that's not even the medical establishment. Like that's not how it's understood. I've even, until I started doing this process, I had asthma I was told it was asthma, but I think it was just fascia incredibly constricted around the throat. And yeah, and I would like, when I was eating, I would always kind of shovel the food in, then gasp, and I couldn't like kind of comfortably breathe through my nose and eat at the same time. Partly there's a kind of like sinus like inflammation from again the chronic stress, and then like my around my abdomen was just so tight I couldn't do like a relaxed belly breath. And then this is just kind of how I lived through my 20s, and it was like I could, on the relative level there was a lot of suffering, but there was this ability to recognize the absolute and just puncture it at any moment. But I would collapse, a second or two back later, I'd collapse back into this feeling of being a self. So there was, um, it did offer a lot of relief, but it didn't. It made sense once I discovered how to integrate and how to bring the two things, the kind of absolute and relative, closer and closer together. Then, yeah, that's been. It was almost like there was a second awakening of on the relative level of like how to start unwinding this tension. And sorry, this is turning to be quite a long backstory, but some of this stuff I haven't spoken about in public before. But so the initially I was kind of interested in I tried mushrooms because I was interested in kind of democratizing the kind of non-dual insight. I was just coming out again from like a kind of there's this insight into non-duality you can have, and I wasn't interested in the kind of emotional stuff or integration stuff. And then, but the mushrooms kind of had that effect of kind of bringing up psychological material that I didn't realize could be addressed. And then after reading the science, I had an MDMA, kind of an intentional MDMA experience by myself. And that in that I basically went straight into the like the kind of the core of the trauma, and my body was hugely kind of energetic of just this intensity of this confrontation with trauma. And it was after that that the kind of what you're doing, I think, when you're processing this stuff is you're bringing it to the surface, so then you can resolve it. At least in my experience, it's kind of like you move towards something that might make you emotionally tense up, and then the wonderful thing about the tremoring is then you can be like, okay, I'm confronting this, and now I can come back to a state of groundedness, regulation. But I didn't have a baseline of groundedness, so my baseline was very dissociated, activated, and so after that, into my experience, the tension went into overdrive, and it honestly felt like I was being kind of suffocated by my own body. Like my breathing was so shallow in my chest. It was like I couldn't do a deep belly breath. It just wasn't an option. So if you watch kind of guided things of like, just relax, do deep belly, that wasn't going to do it for me. And so then I was searching around for what can I do, found the somatic stuff, found David Berceli's trauma release exercises, and it was just exactly what I needed. It was so simple. And it was just like, well, relax this muscle here, and then everything else will unravel. And I just think, wow, like it's kind of that simple. I mean, we'll get into today talking about how from that emerges a lot of complexity in navigating your own experience, and why kind of it can be good to have a coach to help you in the kind of work you're doing. But yeah, I couldn't believe it. And so when I started talking about it in public, I kind of expected. I was kind of like shouting from the rooftops this thing existed, and then everyone would be like, oh yeah, I tried it too, it's amazing. But it didn't seem to happen that way. And I almost wonder if it's too confrontational, too direct. So it really takes you into where you have to go to process your traumas and stuff. But anyway, that's a bit of background for me, but I'll let you pick it up from there.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I can relate a lot to what you shared there. Just I think if I just say like a little bit about myself, I would say what I know about let's say my second year of life. Let's say starting at 12 months old, my mother thought it'd be, we'll back up a bit more. I had a breech forceps delivery that I think was quite challenging start as well. And then at the age of 1, my mother decided it would be a good time to just like take the bottle away from me. And when she told me about it later, she said, I realized that was a mistake. And we know like that, that sucking that children do, it is part of helping the child to regulate their nervous system. So you can see
right.
why that would be, really quite harmful. And then, as I said in the interview with Angelo, I had this fall when I was 18 months climbing out of my crib and ended up being hospitalized for a week with a concussion. And I never had, like, of course, there's no memory about it, and I never thought about it. And it was only until after I encountered TRE and did the facilitator training and started to kind of like understand the kind of things that can happen in childhood that can really impact us, that I realized, oh, I really do think that, there's no way of knowing for sure, but it seems like it has to be a massive trauma to be not just having a concussion, but being separated from the parents in a hospital for a week. There's no end in sight to an 18-month-old that, this is ever going to change, right?
Right.
So, I think that, I kind of went through life with, that trauma in the nervous system, which was impacting my capacity to navigate, just life and stressful situations. And I always had the sense that I think the way I looked at it was, I feel like, I seem to have a hard time managing stress compared to other people. Like I had no way of measuring that objectively, but it was a sense that I had of myself. I think outwardly I looked like I was managing quite well to other people. I somehow held that up. And life just, kind of went on, getting married, having kids, raising a family, and then going through this big, like massive existential crisis in my 30s. Where it was just like full on, like this, seeing, the amount of conflict in the world. Somehow I had been able to avoid it. Just the amount of conflict and dysfunction. And it was like I could see it on the micro level and the macro level. And it was just like, I don't know, like a tsunami just bearing down on me. And I just couldn't escape from it. There was no hiding from it. And it just felt like, could this all be just meaningless? All this suffering, all this conflict and suffering. So anyway, went through this 3 years. And I think like, if I kind of think of it, like that seemed to be a part of this for me. And then I ended up going to a 10-day Vipassana retreat in 2001. And in that retreat on day 8, that was basically what, was like the catalyst for that, let's call it like that first shift, what Angelo calls Kensho, first awakening. And, that was for sure a pivotal moment. And everything changed from then on. But I had no idea, right? Like about what, I wasn't even calling it awakening. I knew something had happened. It felt to me like, wow, this is how life is supposed to be for everybody, and I dearly wanted everybody to know what I was experiencing. It just felt so right. Um, but what I didn't realize is that this awakening process, it has kind of like a predictable pattern to it. And for me, after that 3-month honeymoon period, that natural purging process just got underway. And I found myself like in this very kind of conservative Buddhist tradition in which there really wasn't talk about how to navigate emotion work. There was no talk of even awakening or the stages of awakening. In fact, like it was kind of presented as unrealistic to even go for that, that's just the way it was. But I had like these, deeply ingrained patterns of repression. I didn't understand what was happening to me. And so as these emotions wanted to just kind of come up, like I would just try to meditate my way back into feeling better. And it's just like, I, I don't know. It's just like unbelievable now when I think how long I persisted with this, you know? And
Was it like
I
14 years you were doing Vipassana?
14 years, 14 years, 10-day silent retreats and, 2 hours of meditation a day at home. And I mean, I was getting into absolutely extraordinary states of consciousness. And, one thing I'm going to say about that, I think probably both of you and I would agree that sometimes people can kind of get swept up with psychedelics, like endlessly chasing experiences.
Right.
Well, I think the same potential can happen in the world of meditation, where it can feel like, if I can just get into one of these states long enough, liberation will be on the other end of it, like something like that. And, as I kind of went along and I could see how seductive this was too. There was that aspect of it. And of course, it's also like building up that sense of I'm a great meditator, another problem. Right. So I started to kind of intuit that this was just I needed to figure something out. And the truth is I have a little meditation in my house and I would go in and sit down and it was like the meditation technique just came to a stop. I just couldn't get it going anymore. It like I couldn't will myself to meditate anymore. And so that's kind of like what happened.
And then
Yeah.
you came
And
across non-duality after that?
yeah. Shortly, like it was like I think within maybe a few weeks, I heard this term non-duality, and then it was just like going down this rabbit hole and learning just like this voracious appetite to find everything I could on it. Um, it was like for the first time in my life, I felt like, oh my gosh, like people are actually waking up and becoming fully liberated in one lifetime. Like I had never thought that that was a real thing, that was a possibility. And then when I did, I thought, wow, you know what? I'm going for it. I'm going for it. I'm going to leave the stone unturned. And that, you know, people often talk about seeking energy as being counterproductive. But what I'm going to say, there is something about like having that strong volition, I think, like that strong, they use the term strong determination a lot in Vipassana. And I think if you bring that strong determination to liberation, and it's kind of like you don't know how this is going to look, you don't know where you're going, but like that, just like the full on commitment that I'm going for it.
Yeah, I think
And
there's a kind of a distinction between there's a kind of like what that should be made, but usually isn't. Because I completely agree with you saying that there's like a kind of a neurotic, egoic seeking that kind of intends to hide the ball, intends to be like, this isn't enough. Something has to happen in the future. I'm gonna kind of use that as a way to not do the work I have to do. But then there's like a passionate, like yearning that's very sincere. And I think that's, that energy is what you're talking about, right? And that kind of, because you do actually, you see people who are very like kind of driven and who just go the whole way. Because I mean, it's almost like, for me, I know that the level of suffering I had just propelled me forward. It was just like, if you imagine like that this process is like jumping over a canyon and it's terrifying. So most people are just like, oh, I don't know if I want to jump. But like for me, I'm being chased by a lion, so I'm jumping before I know it, right? It's like, so I think there's that kind of propulsion that can really help people in this process.
Yeah. 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 And I think just, that belief that this is fully available, because I think like that was something that I thought, it seems to me like it's an important part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think so the the whole process, kind of, we're talking about, the way I kind of think about it is you're more increasingly turning to face reality at all levels, whether it's your emotions, your experience. I mean, it's all unfolding experience. But so when you have a tradition that says, that's rigid in any way, that's like, well, we don't do emotion work, we just do that. Like, or even if you're saying to yourself, like, well, I don't need, if you have any kind of, I'm not going to go there. My thing has always been, since I started doing the kind of integration stuff, I guess you could say shadow work, where as soon as I find a thing that I'm resistant to, it's like, oh great, that's where I'm gonna chase that down. And like, because it's non-duality, it's all inclusive. You have, the only way you're going to integrate this is to turn towards absolutely everything. You can't have a locked away door, room that's separate from everything else. That's the whole point of it.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I met Gary Weber in 2016, and that was really fantastic. Do you know Gary Weber at all? Do you know
Yeah,
anything about
yeah.
him?
I've not had him on the podcast, but I'd like to. Yeah.
Oh yeah, he's really amazing, and it just was so helpful. And um, one of the things that Gary kind of really helped was to start to kind of like get me to trust, my experience, to kind of, he said, you're going to notice something, Chris, that the help that you need it's gonna start to feel like it's actually coming toward you. And I would say that that is exactly what my experience has been. Um, I kind of like stepped away from the Vipassana and then met Gary. And then it was, actually, no, it was before Gary. I encountered TRE. That was like 2015, August of 2015. And that was like right away, I kind of knew this was going to be really immense. I just had that feeling, like the way it landed, that very first session. And again, like it was impossible for me to know where that process would go, but I just intuitively knew it was exactly what I needed. If I can kind of summarize where I was at 2015, I could access silence pretty readily. Okay. But on the other hand, I was still quite reactive. Um, I was quite reactive, and I still had lots of issues with, I would say, minor social anxiety, shame, unworthiness, getting into a social situation, even with like my favorite people, my body would be like contracting like all the time. And I had this belief that I was an introvert, that I was one of those people that just prefer to be alone with my books. And which is an interesting thing. Like we can have these beliefs, right, about ourselves. And I came to really see that actually I'm not an introvert. I wouldn't say I'm either an extrovert or an introvert, probably somewhere in the middle. I'm happy with either. But to kind of see how, wow, like all of that shame, all of that unworthiness, social anxiety, reactivity, just like it just kind of like dissolved as the chronic tension dissolved. All of those things went along with it. And I was just like blown away. I was like, wow, here I've been, slogging away for 14 years meditating. And in a space of like a year or two, like the transformation was just, oh, it was just like there was just like no comparison at
Yeah.
all.
I think this really speaks to what I was saying about like the process being one of turning towards, and kind of, the mechanism by which we don't kind of just kind of abide in like a kind of non-dual realized state seems to be that a kind of repression, a turning away, a kind of, and the locking up of tension in the body seems to be a really effective way for us to kind of not face certain things that we don't want to face. And so I think you and I had a very similar experience where before this process, I wouldn't have said I was socially anxious in the slightest. But then as I as I started to kind of release this tension, I realized there was an incredible amount of reactivity, incredible, as you said, just by default with anyone, just like on this very basic kind of primal level. I'm in the presence of another kind of primate. I'm like braced basically. Yeah, and it was surprising. And I think we have a lot of similarities. I was the same where I wouldn't have said I was particularly extrovert or introvert. Even in my extrovert modes, I now see that my liveliness in a kind of party setting was partly a kind of channeling of that anxious energy. And then also at times when I didn't want to do that was also that kind of anxious energy that I just didn't even know was there. It was just locked up as tension. And I would just say, oh, well, I've just got asthma and I've just got this and I've just got all these, these physical diagnoses that were just seen as, we'll just say that's physical. We won't say that's anything functional. That's nothing to do with, there's no insight to be gained about how you're living your life, your past traumas. Like there's nothing rich here. There's only kind of an inert body that's gone wrong and malfunctioned. And and as someone who's trained in kind of, biology and kind of the mainstream biomedical system, it's, the thing you described before about the kind of the fractal, the kind of the way that suffering is kind of, and neurosis is playing out across all scales from individual personal relationships to society. I see it in that system. It's just, it's not grounded in the wisdom that we're talking about here of kind of, it's grounded in a much more kind of, let's keep people, turning up to work instead of flourishing, unfortunately. But yeah, so then with the TRE, right, you find, I mean, it starts in the hips, but then I found it went throughout my whole body. Like I was so surprised when I discovered like my eyes could tremor and my my kind of scalp could contract and release, and just and all it took was, I guess, the initial tremor. So for people who aren't familiar, they can watch my interview with David Berceli. But it's, you do these kind of yoga exercises, very simple, right? You stretch out this psoas muscle, that's very central muscle around the hips, and then you start this kind of this neurogenic tremors, these like things our body can do to help regulate and get rid of stress and come back down to a sense of grounding. But because this psoas is so central, it really starts to unlock tension throughout the whole body. And for me, there was a real logic. There was, I can't really remember the correlations now, but it would be something like my stomach had to release first, and there would be grief and sadness and, there, and then I would get up to my chest, and there would be kind of anger, and it really made sense in terms of the kind of bodily postures we adopt for these emotions. And for me, it was, there was like, it went in a logical order, but it was very intuitive. And also, I think you mentioned in a previous interview I watched that you also worked with biodynamic breathwork.
Yep. Yeah, a little bit. Like I would say, kind of like much later. And
right.
That is an interesting modality, I think, as well. One thing I think that I don't know, thing I would say is I think we have a lot to thank to what's his name? Father body-oriented psychotherapy.
Wilhelm Reich.
Wilhelm Reich. Yeah, I think we have a lot to, well, let me say this, like first, like I think if we think about like what neuroscience has contributed to non-duality, I think like body-oriented psychotherapy has much more on a practical level. And if Dr. Wilhelm Reich, he was a student of Sigmund Freud, and a lot of people consider him to have been Sigmund Freud's most brilliant student. And so what Wilhelm Reich, like he was the first of the analytical tradition to get interested in the body. And he was really interested in why do people have all this chronic tension? And I think, that understanding that in very early life, that early childhood developmental trauma, what happens, the body will go into this like freeze response, and it will, there will be like this muscular tension. It's really kind of like a way for the child to kind of get through an otherwise, you could say, overwhelming experience that could be maybe destabilizing. So, in a way, it's a blessing that we have that. But, to kind of like understand like, well, where the heck does all this chronic tension come from, right? It is largely early childhood developmental trauma where these patterns get laid down. And then another thing I would say is, we can go through chronic stress, maybe in our school years or adult life. And, what we know now is chronic stress, long enough, enduring chronic stress long enough it will become virtually indistinguishable from acute trauma. And that, if we don't have that understanding of why the chronic tension is there, we're kind of like, in a place of just not knowing ourselves well enough, right? And but the good news is like we do have these modalities to break up this chronic tension. And the good news is like once the tension is broken up, it doesn't come back. It's because like that tension was laid down in response to a specific, experience, probably early in life, right? So, in my experience with TRE, just engaging this process long enough, the that chronic tension gets, broken up, the body opens up, and then it puts you in a position that when you're in, let's say, a situation where it could be, considered a stressful situation, that capacity to just stay grounded and present and not dissociated or just become overwhelmed and like freak out, it's just like night and day.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the way that, as someone's listening to this, they may think that, well, I don't suffer from chronic tension. And there can be some telltale signs, right? Like you had jaw pain. Was that one of your symptoms? And, I have mentioned the few that I had, but I think, back pain, I think is a big one, right? We think it's all to do with our lifestyle, sitting over desks and things like that, which I'm sure contributes. But I think a big part of it is probably a lot of stored tension. So I think if someone thinks they don't have any tension, I guess my instinct is to say that is what it feels like to have unprocessed tension. Like you don't really notice it's there. But also for someone with really serious like back pain and things like that, my impression, I'd be interested to get your take on this. My impression is that maybe you could predict like just how much stuff they're going to have to work through, because for you, I think it took 2 years, right, of tremoring to kind of process this stuff. For me, it took about 5. So I think that can be quite a big difference.
Yeah. What I would say is like, it didn't take 1 to 2 years for me to notice benefits. I was noticing benefits pretty low.
Oh, same.
I think like what can be kind of challenging for people that are, maybe exploring TRE and getting started with it is, I think it's like we don't know what we don't know. Like we don't know how much we need it. We don't know kind of like where this is going, right? And it's really kind of like only in retrospect that we can look back and go, oh, I can really see now, what's happened. But yeah, it was pretty dramatic. I mean, I would say like even if I think like at the 2-year mark, probably in this let's call it healing journey, between let's say 2015 and 2017, if I don't know, put a guess on it, maybe I was somewhere in terms of like having gotten rid of, let's say 75-80% of all the tension, something like that. I mean, that's a massive difference in terms of how it feels, and there's it's not just like physically, it's emotionally, it's psychologically, it's a that capacity to kind of navigate stressful situations, interpersonal relations, getting to the roots of reactivity. That's a big one for people that are interested in awakening. That's a really big one.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, like, I think if someone wanted to conceptualize why they would do this, especially in parallel with awakening, I guess you could think about it of the overarching logic being of if you can exist in this moment in a non-reactive way and just be kind of not resisting reality and just be in a complete kind of flow state with reality, then there's minimal to no suffering. And this is a way to kind of to really get into the body, into layers of your organism that you can't just get to through thinking about it or through talk therapy, that you really need to get in there and kind of shake the tissues and let them process what they need to process to come to a place where next time, as you say, you've released that tension, so it doesn't need to come up next time because you've come to terms with it. I think so. For me, I did this in a very kind of, I guess, I did it by myself, and that's partly how it was intended, right? It can be used as a kind of self-help tool, but it can also be done with a coach, like with someone like yourself. But for me, I used it in a kind of body-based psychotherapy way where I did interrogate and understand the stories and the kind of the relational dynamics that led to it and what could be learned and insights that could be gleaned. And I was listening to another interview where you were saying that that may not be necessary. You think that you can, if you just release the tension, you may not need to kind of go into do the psychological processing, which makes sense from a kind of, if you're really going on the kind of awakening side and you're just confronting what's here in this moment. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the relationship between those two.
You know what? Like I will just say that in my own experience, I never had any memories come up except for once, and that was like several years into doing TRE, and I did one time only a 2-hour session. And then towards the end of it, it was kind of interesting. It was almost like I was having like these visual flashes of seeing like baby arms. It's kind of interesting. And I had like a lot of movement in my arms. But I think like, we can vary in our need to kind of like explore how trauma has kind of, gotten lodged within us. Some people do find the need to kind of, come to some understanding about it, that's just, I don't know, part of the process for them. And I think I'll just assume like that's just, some of the differences that exist between people. That's fine,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think different kinds of trauma as well. Like if someone was in an ongoing abusive situation and they suddenly realized that, there was gaslighting, they hadn't realized that, that's when it makes sense to do processing to get yourself out of that situation. Whereas if it was something that can just be kind of shook off because it doesn't have any relevance in the present, I can definitely see there being a spectrum there. So you mentioned something I always forget to mention when I talk about this is that I only did the actual exercises once, maybe twice. But I think because I was working with psychedelics and I had a lot of trauma to release, my body, the neurogenic tremors started. I learned how to do this kind of opening. And then from then it was a psychological thing where I would choose to surrender, and then, or I would, with a psychedelic, it would start. So my approach, I guess I'm not someone who's had a practice of working with TREs, but I've found just that once or twice of getting the process going to be incredibly powerful. But so with someone who's not doing in this kind of heavy duty way with psychedelics, how do you tend to advise it? Do people do kind of a certain amount of minutes every day, or how do you do that?
Yeah, what I would say about that is, we start off, the vast majority of us, like really quite dissociated from their body. So it's kind of like we're missing the information of, what's actually there. Loads of sensations are there, but we can't really consciously access them. And so David Berceli has said, if we were to just rely on our intuition when we got going with this, that would not be ideal. It's because we don't have that self-awareness yet. So it is recommended that people do, let's say, 15 or 20 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week in the first month. If that's going well, you can then experiment with doing a daily session. And I think I encourage people to explore that, because like that will give you a lot of momentum to kind of start to see change. If you just kind of do it when you feel like it, you're not kind of getting enough momentum going to see where this, what this can actually do for you. So, I really encourage people to, check this out. And if they're going to work with this, try to consider taking an approach like that you kind of set up some sort of routine for yourself. And then, eventually you're going to just get enough awareness of yourself to be able to then go, okay, this is, I'm now at a place for what looks like maintenance, Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And when it comes to holding space for people and like working with people, I think, I came at this from a kind of, I wouldn't, how do I say this? The way that I came at can kind of, I guess, was a result of my conditioning as a man as well. I think as part of being like very emotionally repressed and feeling like the solution was to do it myself in a quite a brutal way in terms of like, heavy doses of psychedelics, like pushing myself through it. And I'm trying to say that I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think doing it, being gentle with yourself, because during this process, it was a process of self-love and self-compassion and trying to support myself. But part of, as I mentioned with the example of being chased by the lion, it also felt necessary that I had enough trauma that I needed to do it this way. So just to clarify that I'm not valorizing this very aggressive way of doing this process for yourself. So I think with where people can seek out facilitation or guidance or connection, because I think that has to, as social animals, where these traumas are often social, that's incredibly healing. One of the most powerful experiences of my journey was just being witnessed in a group session on an ayahuasca retreat, talking about my traumas, and it was in a league of its own compared to other things, and all I did was talk in front of other people. So I think that kind of stuff can be really, really powerful, especially since we said before, you're in turning towards repressed material, you're going towards the shadow, you're going towards what you don't want to see. And so that can set off, I think, alarm bells or protective parts of oneself that says, don't go here. And if you're trying to navigate that by yourself, I guess that could get a bit confusing. Maybe that might be the best explanation for why we don't see everyone running towards doing this TRE stuff, because you have to at least have some framework to understand, like, when parts of me come up that say, don't go here, I need to know how to kind of respectfully, like, work with those parts. I'm kind of talking, I guess, now in like IFS type language, but psychological mechanisms that you can respectively kind of move past them without kind of barging past. So I think there can be some nuance there. So do you think that's a place where, like, working with a facilitator like yourself can help?
It can. Many people will report that having a session with the facilitator can allow them to go deeper into the process. I probably had about 20 facilitated sessions myself in that first 2 years, and I've done, even still, like maybe half a dozen since then. And those have been really great. I can tell you, David Berceli has heard from many people about this combination of working with psychedelics and TRE, and people reporting how massively beneficial that's been for him. And I personally know mental health professionals in different countries that are working with clients with both modalities.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you could almost say, in terms of doing shadow work, the way that I approached it was, if you imagine a scenario where it's impossible to have a bad trip because you're kind of intending to move towards the challenging stuff, but then with the tremoring, you can channel it through your body, and with relaxed breathing as well, where you can just kind of feel into it and then let it flow through you and release it. So you're kind of on that knife's edge between taking on stuff to be processed, but also remaining grounded enough, that I think psychedelics kind of give you that space to be able to do that. So yeah, for me, it was incredibly powerful, and I can just, it feels so fundamental in terms of just releasing stress that I think it would be general, and a lot of people can benefit from it, I think.
I think a lot of people experiencing this combination would say, like, there's kind of like a knowing that we're connecting to some sort of ancient wisdom here.
Mm.
And anthropologists, have looked at TRE and said they've seen, these like shaking practices throughout the world in indigenous, communities. So, shaking practices have been around forever. And I mean, to some extent, they've been a part of like few pockets within, Western culture as well. I think David Berceli's contribution is to kind of like bring back to, Western culture this, this understanding that this shaking is actually, something that is like part of our autonomic nervous system to help us to be able to break up chronic tension, to regulate the nervous system, and that we've just misinterpreted like what this shaking mechanism is.
Right. Yeah, I think so I remember learning about how when the British colonized India, the kind of funeral rites in a lot of places, the local people would kind of like lay their hands on the dead person and would cry and shake, and it was very kind of it's exactly, I think it's what we're talking about. It's a very intense experience, and you're processing it by letting your body act it out. And the British put a stop to this, saying that it could spread disease, and I think in that one scene, I think that's almost the kind of nucleus of, I think, what we're facing as a global culture at this point, is that it's understandable that there's a fear. We go into our head and say, well, first there's a kind of discomfort with the raw emotion and the connection, but there's also a legitimate point about what's a rational decision here about spreading disease. But then we've just gone into this kind of the heady, disconnected, tense mode. And the wise thing would be to have both and to say, okay, well, we acknowledge the validity of needing to process, stuff in this way, and maybe we can have it both ways. And so I imagine in a healthier world, if a cornerstone of the kind of the medical industry was a kind of preventative, like centers doing psychedelic healing with somatic modalities like TRE in a preventative way to help people become grounded and relieve stress and I think that could relieve a gigantic amount of the kind of health burden that we see, and hopefully, with people like David doing this kind of work and the stuff that's going on with psychedelics, hopefully we'll get there at some point.
Yeah. I think that there are people that, using psychedelics just somehow intuit their way into the shaking. Like maybe it's in that, opened up state that let's say the defenses that would hold this stuff, at bay get loosened up enough that the shaking just starts automatically, right? And I think like that's what people have seen,
Yeah. And have you, the way that it worked, I think for both of us was that there was a kind of awakening experience first, and then we came to this as a kind of integration tool. But I've also heard you talk about this can actually trigger awakenings in people. And so do you think, I guess that I've seen people talk as well about doing trauma work and saying, well, if you do it before you've had any kind of expansion in your awareness, then you're coming at it from this fundamentally small self-fearful place, and so it's not going to be as effective. But at the same time, I think it's totally worth people doing trauma work if they don't have a meditative practice. So yeah, what's your take on the, I guess, the order of how these things play out?
Yeah, well, I think if somebody's interested in awakening and it hasn't, it's not happened yet,
Right.
I do think that TRE could definitely kind of just like soften up the whole structure. Oftentimes when people are having difficulty, it's because of repressed emotion, right?
Right.
And, coupled with the fear of the unknown. But I have seen it trigger awakening in people, even somebody who had never heard about this, wasn't, never read spiritual books, anything. But if you think about it, like, there's like all of this, energy kind of like bound up in the system. And, anytime we kind of expose ourselves to something that's powerful, whether it's psychedelics or something just happens to us, it could be like relationship breakup or, job loss, anything that's kind of like disorienting. I think that that can be like enough to just kind of like the way that we're trying to kind of like orient ourselves, like, a lot of it is coming from the body, by the way. I'm trying to kind of like stabilize the ego. We've got all of these reference points from the body to kind of like feel like, I know who I am. I know what this environment is. And you start to shake that up, right? It can be just enough, right? That it's like an opportunity for the awakening process to get underway.
Yeah, I think you're totally right that if someone's ruminating in their head about something, most likely there's just something in the body, emotion they don't want to feel, right? And it's something. So that people can construct patterns of kind of beliefs of things they have to be spending their time doing, say like, with the Vipassana for 14 years, where I think often there's like enough sunk cost that people have to think, they tell themselves like, this has to have been for something. And I'm sure, in the Vipassana case, like they'd be able to kind of get into the jhanas and, the concentration. I'm sure that was very beneficial, but it is possible for people to spin their wheels in an erotic way on a project or a certain thing with like, and then after decades have passed, there's just this inability to say, oh no, that was just an avoidance pattern. That was truly neurotic. And now if I want to make progress in kind of awakening, I need to just see that, let go and like grieve whatever, feel whatever I have to feel. Yeah, it ultimately comes back to feeling your feelings, right? And being okay, dropping into them instead of avoiding them in your head all the time.
Yeah. If we can talk about thoughts for a bit, that might be an interesting to kind of speak about, because I think a lot of people coming into, interest in awakening or non-duality, feel frustrated that they just feel like, oh, it's just too many thoughts. All these thoughts are getting in the way.
Right.
And what I would say about that, one thing I think that's really useful to understand is that if we don't ask the question why there's all these thoughts there, again, like it's like we don't, like we're not understanding something fundamental about ourselves. And like what I came to see like so clearly, well, I mean, even the Vipassana experience can be really illuminating in this, in the sense that it can be quite similar to a psychedelic experience when you go on one of these 10-day silent retreats. I don't know if you've ever done one.
I did a Goenka style Vipassana, yeah, and on day 8 or 9, I had like what felt like a full-on DMT trip. Every time I was like closing my eyes, there was this psychedelic, crazy energy in the body. Before I'd done any tremoring, that was the amount of energy within a tense body was really intense.
Yeah. So one thing, what I would say, like that just it just revealed itself to me is that I was so dissociated from my body. And the reason why is just because of all of the let's just say the volume of sensation had reached a threshold that it's just becomes like a maladaptive coping response
Right.
to just go into compulsive thinking, right? You're not just hiding that, but it's just the way it goes, right? And as we kind of work with the body, whether it's TRE or some other modality that's kind of getting to this repressed emotion, and excess sensation, what happens is then it just becomes a natural thing to just kind of like rest in that body sense. It just becomes easy. It doesn't require effort or meditation. It's just we realize like that silence that we've been seeking through meditation is actually already been here. It's just like
Right.
we've got like this static noise that's covering it up, largely from unprocessed emotion.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up thoughts, because it also hits home how the thing we're talking about here is, to me, it's really the center of the bullseye for kind of, and it's so simple, just like releasing this tension, and as we discussed, kind of surrendering to the flow of existence. Because you can imagine someone going to a non-duality teacher and saying, "Oh, I've got all these thoughts. I can't have a still, quiet mind." And the non-duality teacher says, "That's the aim. Isn't to get rid of thoughts, to have a still, quiet mind. They're not the problem. They're arising here now. It's totally fine." But then what no one's talking about is exactly what you just pointed to. What's the thing in the body? What's the fear? What's the reactivity pattern that keeps you vigilant and thinking it's not okay for me to just let go of orienting and just settle into this moment? And it's something in your past that leads to you not feeling like you can surrender right now. So then the thing that makes sense to do, the wisdom would be to say, well, to do that work, to go into the body and release it. And it's so simple. It's crazy to me that for decades people have been teaching non-duality and things without this understanding. And still, you're the only other person I know who talks about this, and you mentioned Angelo Dillulo earlier, who you worked with, and thanks to you, he's starting to talk about it as well and recommend it to people. So I hope it, and I know, David Berceli has connected with kind of spiritual practice as well, but it deserves to be much bigger than it is. So thank you for the work you're doing trying to get it out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I came up against that I think might be in the minds of some people is if non-duality is taking us to this place where we see we're not the body, well, why
Right.
bother with the body at all? Like, let's just move on, right? And go right to the insight. And I could see how, like, if it were presented to me, like, let's say back in my Vipassana years, that, okay, you know what, you're stalled here, right? And you need to start paying attention on the body. I have to, admit that I probably would not have taken that, well. I would have maybe felt like triggered by it and felt like, well, maybe you're suggesting that what I'm doing is insufficient, right? And, it was just like, that kind of, just kind of bucking, right, at hearing this. So I think like that is a thing where we can kind of have like kind of rigid ideas, right, about what we need and how how this is going to unfold. But I think, in my experience, what's really helped me a lot is like what I would just say, like just brutal self-honesty. And one of the things that was like really obvious to me was like the level of reactivity after all of these years of meditation really made me question, like, well, I think I better look for something else. And that was not an easy decision to make.
Right.
But, once I did that and just started to kind of like orient to kind of like looking at what's actually going on in my experience, right? The reactivity, the physical tension, looking at beliefs, the shadow work, all of it, to not avoid any part of it, right? Just, that just became, very
Yeah.
critical.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that kind of relationship, because all of this is playing out on the relative level. And so, no matter how much tremoring you do, no matter how much psychotherapy you do, it's never going to make the isness of what is more is, it's never going to increase it by like 1% or however you want to say that. But there is this, which is why, from my perspective, you, I could say, really nothing has, my insight has not deepened since I was a teenager, since I had my first awakening. Like as I say, like what is just is, and or isn't, however you want to say it. But what I can say is that who I was a decade ago, if that person had started running retreats and stuff, I'm sure there would have been some of my neurosis would have come out. I wouldn't have helped people as effectively as I might if I just got my stuff in order.
Yeah.
And so just on a basic human level, it comes down to a kind of, or as I said, like I can have this insights and can access this place, but I'm collapsing back into something that doesn't feel particularly wise, doesn't feel very grounded, feels reactive, at least internally, even if I'm not kind of putting that into the world. So it comes down just to kind of, as I said before, integrating, bringing these things closer and closer together. I mean, even that's kind of illusion, but we won't go too much into that. But it does get a bit paradoxical. But once you feel it for yourself, you don't. I guess I haven't spent much time trying to think of how you would convince someone that this is worthwhile, because just for me, it's very intuitive. It was just like it was like. Yeah, like if you had like water in a bath that you had to get rid of, and you're like, how am I going to get rid of this? And like trying to use buckets, and then suddenly you just pull out the plug. You're like, oh, there you go. So it was that kind of like, oh, there you go. It's like releasing, and this is the right direction to move in. Yeah, it just feels very intuitive. I'm also interested. You mentioned Wilhelm Reich, and so he had these 7 tension belts, right? They kind of described the body, and I've seen another interview talking about how they seen they kind of could approximate the chakras in Hinduism, and so for me doing this stuff, suddenly I had no interest in chakras and things like that before this, and then suddenly I realized that there is wisdom there into what kind of centers in the body we habitually hold tension around, and I've been doing yoga for a few years by that point, kind of casually, and I think had a relatively serious yoga practice, right? And it seems to me that traditionally, I assumed yoga was doing the same kind of stuff that we're talking about here, really softening up the body to be able to surrender into a more kind of frictionless relationship with reality. But it seems to me now a lot of mainstream yoga it seems like the fascia, the tension of the body can really remain while you get really good at the overall kind of skeletal muscular structure, can do these poses, but you're not really getting in there on a kind of spiritual level.
Yeah. I would agree. I think like attuning to yourself and noticing if there's that tendency to tighten up and contract. And for a lot of people, are pretty oblivious to this. I heard somewhere people who study stress physiology say the average person in a Western urban area is literally tightening up or bracing in some way more than 200 times a day. That's staggering, and if we're like kind of like turning our attention toward ourselves, very often what we're going to see is we're going to notice like there's a lot of inhibition in our breathing, for example. That becomes undeniable. And start to kind of like notice those reactivity patterns when we're around other people. As you're going through awakening, it's like harder and harder to kind of like hide, right, from these patterns. And if we can like think of non-duality, right? Like, well, where this is going is to kind of like a full-on understanding there is nobody else. But if we've still got these responses, these habituated responses, it's kind of like all day long, our body is still acting as if, right, we need to have defend ourselves. And I think like this is the truth is a reality. If there's people that can go through awakening and it's just, so, beautifully organic that they don't have to kind of like find their way to do this, I think that's great. But I think there's a lot of people like, you and me that it's just not happening that way, that we need to kind of like find some means, right? I meet people on a regular basis who come to me who've been, going through the awakening process for maybe 10 years plus. Some of them are pretty hardcore meditators or very, very dedicated. And like they express a frustration that like they can get glimpses of non-duality on a regular basis, but it feels like they're most of the time still stuck in their head. And I tell them, look, I think like what you're up against is that there's still just, all of this repressed emotion, and that's just going to have to be dealt with. Like there's just no other way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I feel like with this, with the Vipassana that you started out with, there's a kind of or an experiential equanimity you're trying to cultivate, right? Like no matter how intense the sensations, you're not going to react psychologically. But then, and that's valuable. But then with the tremoring, at least what I found is if you do that practice and you open to the sensation and you try to be at peace with it, if you have the tremoring in your toolkit, for me, that increases the tremoring, like as I surrender and open. And so so both processes go hand in hand. As you're building up your capacity to handle whatever's in your experience, it's also being diffused. So it's actually getting more easy to handle. So actually, next time something big comes up, you are actually better equipped psychologically to handle it. But at the same time, there's just less stuff coming up for you. And stuff can pass through your system more because it's not kind of, triggering other things. And I feel like with this process, people can get kind of a lot of restlessness in their experience. But yeah, so do you think this is a useful tool for people to deal with that kind of with restlessness and equanimity?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I've not had to, deal much with like restless energy, which I think is because of the amount of TRE I did,
Right.
going back to 2015, 2016. It was just largely, just like a sense of well-being and, equanimity and just ability to just kind of like stay grounded and very comfortable in my body, which really became, super helpful. It's just, yeah, I do meet people who have very abrupt awakenings where it's like identity falls away and they've not done any emotion or shadow work. And that can be really quite challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. And then as you're, I agree that kind of for me, it's like night and day when it comes to the comfort in my body now. But the process was one of really going into the discomfort and feeling through it. So it's not all, roses. And I think that's partly why people struggle to orient in this direction, because you are orienting towards what you don't want to feel. And but I highly recommend it. I think if it's done in a safe way with support, it's for me it was really an invaluable tool.
Yeah. Yeah. David Berceli has pointed out, he says like people can have a misunderstanding about TRE, that it's about just endless sense of well-being, right? But that's a misunderstanding. It's really about like developing the capacity to be with whatever is happening, right? Without, going into dissociation or emotional repression.
Right. Yeah. And so it's pretty well saying, for me, it was very much about re-experiencing memories and going to very intense, difficult stuff. But I've also heard you say that for some people, it just feels like kind of like a nice massage or something. And you mentioned yourself, you weren't having these like vivid re-experiencing of traumas. So yeah, do you think there's a spectrum there where some people it's not as confronting as it was for someone like me?
Yeah. I also should mention I have aphantasia, so that may be probably why I didn't
Oh,
have
right.
it.
Fair enough. That's interesting. Has that changed with any of this kind of awakening process stuff?
You know what? I am noticing something interesting, and it has to do with, I don't know, seeing what I would say kind of light when I close my eyes. It's almost even subtly there with my eyes open. But I've had like, kind of like it feels like light, and sometimes even just kind of like light moving, kind of like yeah. So anyway,
Something.
I can't visualize a red apple or anything.
Yeah. Maybe to finish on, do you have any kind of advice for anyone who's getting into this for the first time?
Um, if somebody is listening to this and they want to try it for the first time, two things they can try is David Berceli's website, TRE for All, has some nice resources. There's some videos on YouTube. I'm not crazy about most of them, to tell you the truth. But I do think people can try this on their own, especially if, like it's a barrier for them to find somebody to work with. If you can work with somebody, I would say that's ideal to get started, to work with somebody, to have a few sessions. It is by and large a DIY process, but a skilled facilitator can really help a lot in kind of getting you off to a good start, and to kind of give you, kind of guidance that's tailored to you. I also have some resources on my website. I have a resource page with a section specifically on TRE with things that I would recommend in particular, so people could have a look there.
Great. And could people book sessions with you there if they want to work with you with this stuff? Great. And also, one thing I want to wrap up earlier, we briefly touched on biodynamic breathwork, which I haven't tried myself, but in seeing, because you mentioned it in a previous interview, in seeing what it's about, it seems to describe the kind of process that I intuitively went through myself, which is to couple this tremoring with, first with breathing, but then, intentional breathing, whether that's to kind of activate a state of arousal to get in touch with emotion, or to regulate and calm down, but also to then move into emotions to kind of express, as I mentioned, like anger and sadness or whatever it is. So I think that could be, I'm going to look myself more into that modality in terms of, thanks for bringing that to my attention for where to kind of send people. Because for me, it was a very, as I say, very natural, intuitive process, but it's useful to break it down into specific tools that people can then pair together.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything that can kind of like really soften up,
Right.
the body, open things up, is going to be helpful.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
Oh, thank you, James. Yeah, it's been delightful to chat with you. Yeah.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.